All right, welcome. Today, we would really like to welcome and have everyone join us with Valora. Today, our speakers are Sandy Serkis as well as Jennifer Nelson. I'm Veronica Kelly with MER and ARMA, and today's Sapient webinar is titled Beyond Rot, Mastering Data Minimization and Least Privilege. Thank you again to Valora for partnering with us. Today, during the webinar, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. If we could flip to the next slide. Thank you so much. If you'd like to ask any questions today, the presenters would be happy to answer during and at the end of the webinar. So feel free to put any questions into the Q&A function box, and we will be checking periodically and involving questions as we go. We also ask that you participate in some polls today. So those will be read out loud, and if you can just give us your feedback, and we'll review those as well. After the webinar, there'll be handouts as well as a recording shared. And your feedback is really important to us. So there'll also be a survey at the end of the webinar that will automatically be sent out. We would love to have your feedback. The webinar is being recorded. And like I said, a link will be sent to you via email post the webinar for later use. Now, I would like to introduce today's panelists, Sandy Serkis and Jennifer Nelson. I'll turn it over to you to start the webinar. Thank you again, everyone, for joining.
Awesome. Thanks very much, everybody. Welcome. As Veronica had said, my name's Jen. This is Sandy, and I recognize a lot of names on that attendee list. So welcome, friends. We're glad you're here. Next slide, please. Well, I'll tell you. I'll share this little tidbit with you. Usually we are in different cities, let alone in the same room. And today we are presenting from just outside of Boston. Look at We're together. We're in the same room. No, we're not. Okay. Trust us, we're in the same room. We're pretty darn excited about it. But we've got a lot to cover today, so let's jump right in. So our agenda today is going to be quite broad. We are talking about data minimization, which might be relatively new to folks in IG and IM. So we're going to be talking about what is data minimization, what is that definition, why is it important in general, why is it important now and going into the future, and who is kind of leading the way and where can we look to gain insight about data minimization. We're going to talk about where that intersection of data minimization and RIM and IG intersect. Whose job is it? Why are people in IG best positioned to help establish and manage and maintain these kinds of data minimization efforts? And we're going to talk about how to stand up a data oh my God, say that 5 times fast. Data minimization program. And what does a typical data minimization program look like? Or what does a policy look like? And some tools to help you. And then we'll also talk about how using auto classification can help to enable and really get a good foundation to set up a really good DM program. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Next slide, please. We have some polls that we're going to ask everybody just so we kind of get an idea of who's on the call today. So first poll question is, what industry are you from? And welcome.
We don't control these. Veronica does.
We don't, no. I think we'll give everybody like a minute or so. We'll just give everybody a couple seconds to fill this one out.
This is meant to be easy.
Not a skill testing question at this point yet. Okay, cool. So the results from poll number 1. So this is kind of who we are on the call today. So that's great to see. Thank you again and welcome. Poll number 2 gives us a little bit of insight about what your role is in your organization. There we go. And if you don't kind of recognize your role here and you are other, I'd love to see in the chat what that role is.
I'd also love to know, given the topic today, if any of you have data minimization in your title, please tell us that.
Overwhelmingly, records and information management. Of course, that's great. And some data privacy security. Awesome. That's awesome. Okay. Poll number 3. This is a quickie too. What are your organization's priorities for when you look at your overall IG practice? What are you guys focusing on, either maybe this year or is coming up next year?
I love that last one.
Usually, overwhelmingly, it is that one that people answer. Few more seconds. Okay. Okay. Oh, look, almost everybody. OMG, everybody for everything. Okay, well, that's really good insight. Thank you for that. We appreciate that. Okay, so let's get into it. As Veronica had mentioned, if you've ever been on a webinar with Sandy and I, we're pretty easygoing. So if you've got a question and you're thinking about it, go ahead and put it in the chat box or the Q&A, whichever you prefer. I'll kind of keep my eye out for it, and I'll interrupt Sandy nicely.
Now I can reach you.
That's right. Now I can like stop talking. Now we can we'll interrupt nicely the presentation, answer those questions as we go, because it is quite conversational. We like to keep it interactive. So without further ado, I will pass it over physically to Sandy.
Okay, thank you, Jen.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. I know some of you might still be morning, so good morning to you. So excited to talk with you about data minimization, because I've been researching this for months, and man, have I got a lot of info for you. Okay, so first up, what is data minimization? It sounds like just one of those phrases, kind of hot phrase of the day. And yes, it is, but that's because it keeps coming up in regulations. So it's definitely a phrase that we need to understand and be comfortable with. So data minimization, specifically in the context of information governance, is basically a principle about the collection and use of data. And in this case, data kind of means almost anything. It might mean data like, what's your birthday? It might mean data like, what's your birth certificate? Or it might mean data like, what was your last transaction with my organization? All of those count as data, just so that we're clear. And we'll get into this later too. What does collecting mean? For the moment, let's just say it means the data exists. We'll stop there. So basically, it means this practice of having data about individuals, okay? It's especially important when it's personal data, but not exclusively. So any data does count in the context of data minimization. We're going to come back to that. So compliance regulations, again, just so we're clear, these are regulations. Everybody knows GDPR, everybody knows CCPA in California. We're going to get into this. There are now 12 US states with data privacy laws as of literally September 11th. And you have to have a lawful basis for why you collect the data that you do, how you use it, how long you keep it, and in what manner you dispose of it, okay? So that's what the kind of compliance regulations demand of you. We're going to come back to lawful basis in just a moment. And then finally, data minimization is essentially a key component of what I would call data hygiene, about healthy living around the content that you store and manage. Yes, it comes up all the time, right? When it's records cleanup day, when it's e-discovery time, when it's data breach, sure. These are the moments where it comes to the fore, but data minimization, like information governance, frankly, should always be occurring kind of in steady state mode. Okay, there are a couple of key aspects of what data minimization should include as a practice. Number one is only collecting the data that is necessary. A good example of this, I go to buy some toothpaste at the local drugstore. Why are they asking me my zip code? In what manner is the zip code relevant to the brushing of my teeth? And the answer is it's not. It's relevant because they want to market to me and know my zip code as like kind of a demographic stand-in. So that kind of thing is going to start to become more and more of a no-no. of just collecting data because you can, or because it might be interesting, or because you might want to use it later. It's going to have to be much more explicit. Why are you collecting it? Why are you collecting it now? And what is the only way in which you're going to use it? None of this squishy, might be useful later kind of thing. This is like the fundamental definition of where data minimization picks up. Okay, there are also processing limitations. So collecting, we talked about, is essentially having the data. Processing is what you do with it. So if you are taking my zip code while I buy toothpaste, are you going to then do some kind of data science on the background and say, oh, she must live in this town, and then, the median income of that town is blah, we should market to her like this, okay? There are processing limitations about how you're allowed to use the data that I give you or that you collect. Then we have retention periods, obviously, with 77% of the audience being records managers.
What's the retention period?
You know what I'm talking about. But I'm not talking about records retention in the sense that this is a record and per the RRS, we're keeping it this long. This is specifically a unique retention period. You can think of it as a separate retention period related specifically to the use of that information, as opposed to the document type or the record that it is. Those retention periods very likely would be different. And we're going to get into this too. Who wins? And then just for kicks, let's throw legal hold in there. Now who wins? So we'll come back to that. All right. Next up is data sharing. One of the key aspects of data minimization is not just why did you collect what you did, is who's allowed to use that? Who's allowed to see that? Who's allowed to process that data? If the drugstore is collecting my zip code, is it available to everybody who works in the drugstore? And when they shout out my, birth date to the, to the entire people waiting to pick up their prescription, are they sharing my personal data with the entire room? So this concept of data sharing and minimizing that, you might know, especially you government folks, you know that as the phrase need to know. This is the same kind of concept. And then we, of course, have data anonymization. Most people know what that is. It's intentionally disguising the party or some attribute about the party. Very common use would be, let's say it's a minor, right? And we can tell from the birth date that this data subject or this person is under 18 years of age. So we don't give their name. We just say a minor or Jane Doe or something like that. That's data anonymization. Okay, any questions so far? Jen, who I can look over at.
No questions yet.
This is never going to get old.
I won't. I think I might move it. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, Sandy, you keep saying collect data, collect data. That's quite a broad phrase, and it basically covers anything you can think of. So here you go. There's the direct voluntary submission. In other words, I tell you my date of birth, my social security number, and be careful, do I tell you of my own free will, or are you withholding service or product unless I give you that information? Are they not going to sell me that toothpaste if I don't supply the zip code? Unclear. Okay, but it doesn't really matter whether it's truly voluntarily or on the line of coerced. It counts as voluntary submission. In other words, I am giving it up to you. That's the kind of legal terminology. Obviously, most people can kind of readily think of that one. What we tend to forget about is automated systems. So are you Google? Are you tracking everywhere I go on the web? Or worse, are you tracking my cell phone everywhere I go? That's an automatic data collection. Are you some sort of organization with whom I transact regularly, like my bank? Automatic data collection, all of that counts. And note the devices. What they really mean is the cell phone on that, or
your
Apple
Apple
Watch,
Watch
yeah.
or whatever you got going there.
Yep. This is another one that people tend to overlook is third-party sources. Are you buying lists of potential users or customers so that you can market to them? That counts. Are you either openly or inadvertently kind of getting access to data that would fit the bill here? My example of that is, let's say you have a spiffy package from LinkedIn, like Sales Navigator or one of these. Are you able to isolate or triangulate down on people's unique assets? How close do you have to get to personal data to start to fit the bill here? Remember, data minimization is not only about PII, it's about data, period. Okay. All right. Other thing, this is a little bit like voluntary submission, surveys, questionnaires. There's going to be a questionnaire at the end of this webinar. I hope it's not asking you for your social
Don't put your birth date in.
Don't put it in there, but that is the kind of thing. And no, customer feedback mechanisms. I like the blue flavor, or I wear an extra large. Like, you're just dancing on some of these areas. And obviously, you guys know that one, physical documents, kind of chock full. And then this is another one that people tend to overlook because they think that personal data tends to be only about customer data or client data. Every one of your employees in your organization has personal data, and almost certainly your organization is holding some of it. By law, you must hold some of it. Think of an I-9 form, which is verifying the right to work, at least here in the United States. So the employee records are absolutely chock full of content that is collected under this definition. Okay, we also use the phrase lawful basis. So what is lawful basis? Basically, it means that you have a legitimate reason for collecting the data in the first place. And the ones, the pretty pictures on the bottom, thank you, Jen, are the ones that are specifically defined in GDPR. They are not the only ones, and you can and should define them yourselves. So that's one of the nice things about lawful basis is you get to define the rules in this context under which you will live. So let's keep it really simple. You have a lemonade stand and you're going to sell lemonade, and you're going to collect people's birthday data because on their birthday they get a free lemonade. Okay, so that would be, and you would say, the lawful basis is that we are going to have a product offering or service offering in which on a birthday we're going to provide some free product. And that then becomes your justification. So we're going to collect birthday data. We're only going to use it for this purpose. And then if the person, sounds kind of creepy, fails to have any more birthdays, we will go ahead and delete that data, or maybe they move out of town, or they ask us specifically, please forget about my birthday. Okay, obviously this is overly simplistic, but I did that on purpose because what you conduct as a business doesn't technically matter. It's what you say you will do and how you say you will act that you have to live by. And I know some of you are clever out there and you're thinking, oh, well, I'll just say I'm going to use your data for any purpose. You can't do that. You have to define it, and then you have to live by it. And here's the kicker. You have to prove that you do and have done so, and that you have the ability to do so going forward. You don't just get to go, yeah, we're good. You have to prove it. We're going to come back to that. Okay. All right. So that takes us to least privilege. Earlier, I was talking about minimizing data sharing and need to know. That is, the fancy term is least privilege. And what is meant by that is, what is the least amount of privilege or kind of like permission that you can allow of this data or of this document to perform the business task that needs to be performed. So we see it today, very common in a data security context, where we'll say something like, this is everybody's compensation data. So the only people with access to that folder are going to be in HR level X or higher, something like that. And that's fine. That's a data security context. That is, as typical with InfoGov and records, that's not quite strong enough for the data governance context, in which it has to get down to the unit data in the document. And that's the difference between these two pictures here. So maybe I'm allowed to see the contract in full that Valora has, contracted with a supplier, but Jen in her role, kind of more on the marketing and sales type end, only can see that which she's allowed to see. That's least privilege. She doesn't need these redacted pieces to do her job or to conduct her business. So least privilege would mean she's restricted from seeing the pieces of this that are not relevant to her doing her job. So that's the distinction. Data security tends not to get down into the content layer of files, whereas data governance absolutely positively does get down into that. Just to take the example that I laid out, here's compensation data. Sometimes you'll see that even more granular. This is executive comp. It's a spreadsheet that has the entire company and everybody's comp, but the executive comp is blacked out for certain level employees, whereas the full thing is available to certain level employees. That's a great example of data governance, and it is very much part of this picture of data minimization. Data minimization doesn't only mean data deletion. Yes, that's a big component, but that's not the only thing. It can very well also mean what you see, what you're allowed to know, what you process, even simple things like what you could print or download. Those are elements of data minimization, certainly least privilege also. So all that permissioning that we tend to think about with applications or with file systems, it's all of that again, but down at the unit content level, which of course is going to beg the question of, do you know what your unit content is? Those who know Jen or me or have seen any other Valora presentation ever know that that's the entry point for auto classification. It lets you know what you have. We'll come back to that. Any questions so far?
No, we're good.
All right. You guys are still awake, right? You're with me? All right. I did warn you there was a lot coming. Okay. So we've kind of touched on this already, but data minimization is absolutely standard fare. It is absolutely the language of data privacy regulations. Yes, everybody's favorite standard bearer, GDPR. These are direct quotes right out of it, so you can see. But here's CPRA from California. And these are two federal pending, federal in the US. And again, you can see the kind of language. And I really wanted to talk about this Data Care Act, that's the latest incarnation of an attempt at a federal law in the US. We shall see in our current partisan environment what happens. But they were the first to really kind of coin this language of duty of confidentiality, duty of loyalty. That's loyalty to the customer or loyalty to the employee. And particularly any kind of use of those that is to the end user's detriment. And this is where all the legal discussion is going to come up. What counts as detriment, right? If the drugstore starts spamming me because of my zip code, is that to my detriment? I would argue it is. And so that duty of loyalty, who is their loyalty to? Their marketing department or me, the purchaser of the toothpaste? Think about that. Okay. Why now, Sandy? Well, I have to ask this. Anybody out there from Delaware? Because you guys got a brand new data privacy law 2 days ago. Well done. And yours is even more restrictive than one of the high water barriers in the US, which is Virginia. So take a look at that. That was big news. So this is they're just unfolding. This is a great chart. And just to show you, this was last updated 8.4 and Delaware wasn't quite even there yet. So You could see Delaware was kind of a dark green. It hadn't even passed or signed at the time that I made these slides all of a couple of days ago. So this is hot and heavy right now. It is only going to continue. The fact that we don't have a federal law is just going to make this more and more complex. And of course, each state's requirements are just slightly different. I mentioned Delaware, one, because it just happened, and two, because many, many organizations in the US are incorporated in Delaware. Hi, Valora is. And therefore, you are somewhat beholden to the laws of where you've incorporated, much less where you actually do business. So because Delaware just happened, that's a biggie. And I'd be willing to guess that a lot of you on this call will need to investigate where are you actually incorporated and how much of those Delaware privacy laws affect you, even if you're operating in California or wherever else. This is also from both the last slide and this slide come from the IAPPP. That's a nonprofit organization. Anybody can join. They have spectacular information. I highly recommend you visit that website from time to time. This is just an example of what they have. You know, by state, what are the regulations? What's different? You know, do they have this thing, that thing? It's just fantastic. And I will say, I kind of put this out on social media. I'm delighted that you're all here because too many records folks particularly tend to think that data privacy, data minimization, whatever, is somebody else's problem. I have been in this business long enough to recognize that phrase. That's what we used to say about e-discovery. That's legal's problem, somebody else. Well, it has become the problem for InfoGov because we are the curators of the enterprise's content. We know what's there. We know what should be deleted. We know how to find things. We know how to classify things. And so, of course, e-discovery comes to us. We're the first stop when they have a request. Well, what do you think is going to happen with data minimization? It's just right behind it. And so good on you, everybody, today for getting out ahead of this. Okay, so who is actually leading the way? Some of these will seem obvious. Yes, of course, healthcare. They're very used to dealing with PHI, which is health information. You'll see banking. Again, the organizations that are dealing in data all day long and have a long legacy, particularly on the personal data side, they are, of course, leading the way. But they're not the only ones. You'll also surprisingly see this in retail because it's coming down on their heads about basically how lenient and lax they have been about personal data. Technology and software, Valora would count in that category, kind of making applications and data storage systems minimization aware. Just like we're trying to make things records aware or e-discovery aware, now we're making them data privacy, data minimization aware. Government and public sector, you guys are also leading the way. You're good with regulation, you're good with documentation, so, you know, naturally. And of course, the energy and the utilities, and I think that's just from the sheer volume of content that you manage. So if your organization or your sector you think is doing a great job and we don't have that on here, I would love to hear from you. This is what my research uncovered. So please educate me if you know of another industry sector that's really leading the charge on data minimization. So, okay, I get it, Sandy, data privacy. But isn't there any other reason, you know, to get on board with data minimization? Because for whatever reason, my organization has the data privacy folks over there. Okay, I get it. And the answer is, heck yeah. There's a zillion reasons that data minimization is smart. It is smart data hygiene, period, without even the regulation and the data privacy element. Remember, it applies to data beyond just personal data. These should look familiar to you. These are the same arguments for records disposition, for proper information governance, for defensible deletion, for actually removing legal holds for matters that have concluded, right? These are those same arguments, just kind of recycled again with a different context, which is data minimization. And data minimization would say, yes, you get all of these benefits just by, it's not just cleaning up your data, it's only keeping the data that you said you would keep for the duration you said and purpose you said you'd keep it. That's the angle that gets laid on top of just, well, time has passed. You get that more kind of purpose-driven aspect to it. Okay, so what is the overlap between data privacy or data minimization and records management and IG? Hopefully already you're hearing a lot of the same kind of language, a lot of the same approach, philosophy, and here it's going to be laid out very clear. Here's data privacy. What sensitive data do we have? Where is it? Who has access to it? Are we handling it correctly? The collection, the processing, the use, the reporting, the disposal. Whoops, wrong button. And what do we have around that's not supposed to be here? That last one should sound very familiar to all of you, because I know you're thinking that all the time about your records. So, oh, one more. And can I produce the information needed on command when needed? In a data privacy world, that often comes with a DSAR, data subject access request. Literally an employee or a customer going, hi, I'd like to know what you have on me. You have 30 days to respond. Go. Okay, that's a DSAR. In records management, we don't always have that kind of time window or that immediate initiation from a person. It's usually more like we have an e-discovery request, or we have an investigation, or for you forward thinkers, it's time to clean out the records. Let's go. So the same type of behavior takes place, except it's on the broader, it's not necessarily sensitive information. It's kind of, what do we got going? What information do we have, including sensitive? Where is it located? Who has access? Are we handling it right? What do we still have? What's past retention, right? What do we have that shouldn't be? Or what is available to all but is sensitive? Why is this sensitive information floating around on the file share? And then, of course, same thing. Can I produce what's needed promptly and only what's needed? So you can see the kind of the mirror life between these two areas. And as I said earlier, this is going to collapse onto here because you guys are the stewards of the enterprise's data. Again, I'm using data in the most broadest sense of the word. You could say content, you could say files, record, they're all the same. Okay, so in an organization, who is typically responsible for data minimization? Well, this should look real familiar. It's the same kind of club that you tend to see leading information governance efforts. It's usually not just one person. It's usually a cross-disciplinary team coming from the likes of this. It's almost all the same ones. This should sound a lot like IG, well, because it is. Okay, Sandy, you said how we could stand up a program. So yes, you can. It's going to be 10. Super easy.
Super easy.
Yes.
Super easy.
Super easy. At least it's only 10, not 7,000.
Yeah.
So, okay. And I've divided this into you will need and you will do. So first, you will need an understanding of the regulations, that legal basis that your organization falls under. You'll need to know things like, how many customers do you serve? If your answer is 3, you're going to have really different requirements than if your answer is 3 million, okay? Those inform the legal basis. So you're clearly going to want to work with your inside counsel or your outside counsel to understand the regulations that you are responsive to and have to form a statement, that legal basis that says this is what we will do and how we will behave in response to that regulation. So clearly that's number 1. And then just like you've done in records, again, records management is so good at this, at literally defining what is a record, how you will know it's a record, how you will tag it, how long you will keep it, and so on. That same type of thing has to go on, but for this more data-oriented context, like what are you going to be collecting? Why are you collecting it? How long are you going to keep it? What are you going to use it for? What are you not going to use it for? Because you can't just leave it open and hope no one will notice. That doesn't fly. So all of that goes into the policy. So those policies are a little bit richer and thicker than a typical records retention schedule, but they're fairly similar. And then, you know, if I could underline 19 times number 3 here, I would do that. You guys know it's very difficult to implement change and new tools and new ways of thinking without that executive support. My advice to you is get legal on board with you, and they will pull the executives along to go, thou shalt, because that is how the regulations are written. So you definitely want to get that executive support, and not just to kind of investigate. When I say executive support, I don't just mean like buy-in, like you go girl. I mean, like, here's, you know, here's $500,000 budget to enact this kind of thing. That is executive support. So, and to recognize, and you guys should put this out there, that this data minimization, like InfoGov, is not a one and done kind of thing. Yes, there's probably an early level of clean up, get the house in order, but from there, it is a persistent, perpetual requirement that requires you to be diligent about looking, going, are we in compliance? Have we gotten rid of that data? Did we do what we said we would do? Can we prove it? Right? That is the ongoing nature to this. And I think a lot of executive teams what they want is for this to be a one and done project. Like, oh, we just install a firewall and we're done. It's not like that. It is an ongoing perpetual need. So you will need, of course, appropriate tools. Very different to have immediate cleanup tools than it is to have ongoing auditing, monitoring, kind of assurance type tools. Ideally, tools that do both would be, you know, great. And there are some, but not all of them do that. So you want to make sure you've got the right tools at the right time. And I've kind of already stressed the ongoing. You too don't get to just install this and walk away. You will need to be on top of this. So that's what you will need. This is what you will do. So first up, this should sound very familiar. You're going to take a data inventory. Some people call that data discovery. Some people call it data mapping. Lately, I've been hearing data lineage, data provenance. I think those two are slightly different and beyond the scope of today, much as I'd like to talk about them. So email me if you want to have a conversation about those. And in your essentially assessment of your data universe, then starting to have tagging and retention criteria. And when I say retention criteria here, I don't mean the records kind of capital R retention. I mean the data minimization, the DR type of retention. How long are you going to keep this and why? We didn't just lose everybody, did we?
No, we lost. I think we lost.
Okay, all right. Then what I kind of call baseline tagging and disposition. Once you establish what the criteria will be, remember that lawful basis, then you're going to go through and, you know, crawl systems and start adding tags to everything and say, okay, this is one of those. This contains that kind of data. Therefore, it is subject to this, 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 and therefore it needs to be retained unless and until blah, blah, blah. That's what baseline tagging and disposition is. Like with many of these types of endeavors, I highly recommend you get the low-hanging fruit off first, your good old rot, because if you can get rid of dupes, for example, that's that much less information that you have to worry about minimizing later. You can think of rot as like a really poor man's type of data minimization, or kind of the machete path along your data minimization, you know, quest. And then finally, of course, I mean, it's me, of course, I'm going to suggest that you implement automated retention that is data privacy aware. So it's not enough to have what I would call sort of a simplistic automated rule or tag that says, oh, this is a termination letter for an employee, therefore we keep it for 7 years, come 7 years, out it goes. it's not that simple anymore. If that employee gives you a DSAR and says, I'd like you to forget about me, what are you going to do there? Who wins that tussle? Do you have to get rid of it within 30 days because it fits the data minimization? Or what did you say when you had hired the employee or when you terminated them for how long you were going to keep their information? Did you say anything? Probably not. Okay, so you see kind of where these are kind of coming in conflict with one another. All of these kind of conflicts are going to have to get resolved because they're required under this regulation. You have to state what you will do and then prove that you are doing it. So just saying we're gonna keep this employee's thing for 7 years may or may not be sufficient. It may depend what that termination letter actually says. Okay, so good news. What does a data minimization program or policy actually look like? Looks a heck of a lot like a records retention schedule, but with a few more columns maybe. So most RRSs that I've seen tend to have, some sort of numbering schema, some sort of record class, a definition or exemplars, and then some sort of retention window. The fancy ones, and I've been advocating for this for years, should also have what is the disposition method? Does it require authorization? Does it require certificate of destruction? Blah, 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 all of that. So hopefully you guys all have that column too. Now we're going to add a few more, which is what is the least privilege of this record? Who is allowed to see or do what with it? Right now we're just like, yeah, it's a record. It's personnel record. Well, can anyone see that? These are the words or the concepts of data minimization. It's not just what is the record. There's this element of who. Who is the record about and who is using it? You have two who's there. Okay, so that is going to start to become a column in your records retention schedule. Who is allowed access to that? And what level of access, right? We talked about least privilege. Can everybody see everything, or do different user classes, for lack of a better word, have different access? Okay. Then we have what I kind of call intended life cycle versus record life cycle. You already know what the record life cycle is, but what's the intended life cycle? What did we say at the time of data collection would be the life cycle of this piece of data? And how does that match when we treat the document as a record? And by the way, what if we have 6 pieces of data in there with slightly different intended life cycles in there? Who wins? This is the kind of stuff that's going to get hammered out in the next, I'll say, 3 years. What are the time or event triggers that force the disposition forward? In other words, here's a record. It's got its record class. It's got its retention period. You haven't hit it yet. La la, everything is great. What could trigger a deletion event, a defensible deletion? Well, a DSAR could do it. And so that is a trigger, a different kind of trigger than we are historically used to in records and information governance. We are used to a trigger being something like a termination or an M&A activity, things like that. Now we have triggers that can come from the data subjects themselves. And that trigger does force the disposition forward if that's what's being asked, and that document is not under legal hold, not a particularly sensitive or important file, but we just keep it because we keep it. That's going to trigger. So it's a whole new class of triggers. Another thing that you're going to start to see is data privacy citations. I know some of you are really kind of sophisticated in your record citations, particularly on the government side, where you're saying we're keeping this record because of regulation X that states. Okay, you're going to see the data privacy versions of that. We're keeping this only as long as X or until X trigger per data privacy citation X. So we're going to start to see that kind of thing. And then, of course, we need to start accounting for sensitivity. Usually people are aware of sensitivity, but you don't tend to see that in the records retention schedule. It's either assumed, well, all records are sensitive, or there's like kind of a soft notion of these are more sensitive than those. That's going to have to become explicit Why? Because who's allowed to see, how long you keep it, what they're allowed to do is going to trigger off of the sensitivity. So that's going to have to start to become a data field or a metadata tag that you track. That's what all of these are going to become, are metadata fields on each piece of content that you are holding, whether record or otherwise. Okay, so obviously, hopefully that makes it clear, single tab record keeping, not enough. I know there are some systems out there that are like, record glass, and that's it, and that's supposed to tell you everything. That absolutely, utterly will not fly here and would be completely non-compliant. So if this is the world that you are living in, we should probably have a chat, because that's, you're like looking for trouble with this. So again, need to kind of add in this concept of disposition labels. It's going to require a lot more kind of communication between InfoGov, compliance, those types, particularly with like sales and marketing, who are the ones that are often asking for this kind of data, and to get on the same page about what is being collected, why, for how long, etc., so that you guys can make sure in the back that you are complying with the behavior that they're doing and that all of you are documenting it correctly. As if that wasn't complicated enough, this gets complicated quickly. So for example, you might have a policy that says, we keep client transaction data for 3 years past the transaction date, right? Straight up. However, unless that client who the transaction was with submits a DSAR and kind of elects their right to be forgotten and says, I need you to forget about me, now that retention window went to 45 days. And then, of course, everybody's favorite, unless it's under legal hold, in which, no, it didn't. And so you can see this interplay and getting caught. And so what is compliant, what is not, who's on top, who rules when, all of that has to get kind of sorted out. Legal hold, it's kind of its own category. Let's leave that one off for a minute. Just the other two really can conflict with each other very quickly. And so we get to kind of the crux of today's webinar, which is, and I know almost all of you, raise your hand if this does not apply to you, are living with records that are past retention, okay? And in the past, we just kind of, I don't know, let that slide. Why? But that's not going to fly anymore. It's not okay to keep something past retention because it's a direct violation of data minimization. And listen to how they talk, okay? Data minimization will say something like, you will zip code no longer than 30 days, which is the time in which she might have returned that toothpaste. And you will only use it to contact her in the event of a product recall. I'm just making stuff up here, right? But you're going to keep it no longer than. Compare that to how records management typically speaks, which is no shorter than. We're going to keep this termination letter at least as long as 7 years past the date of termination, but in practice, a heck of a lot longer. Okay, so you see the conflict that is happening here. And so what's starting to happen is this concept of a life cycle window that has a minimum and a maximum. Okay, so the rim is the minimum. We'll definitely keep it this long, and the maximum coming from data minimization saying no longer than X number of days after trigger. Okay, so those have to live concurrently. So what you wind up with is a minimum and a maximum that hopefully don't do this. If that happens, you have to sort that out. But the idea is that you're putting a boundary on both edges and naturally subject to legal hold. Jen, some questions? I see some.
There are. I was trying to write my thing. It said 10 minutes.
Oh, okay.
There are questions. I think they're probably more appropriate for the end.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right, great. We'll hold them to the end. And then I'll just state the obvious. Even though these are already in conflict and yet another reason to get rid of data that you're not supposed to have, if you retain it, it's discoverable. Think. All right. So now, if you take nothing else from today's webinar, when I get to this yellow box, take that yellow box home and instruct your organization what's what, okay? Historically, records management folks, InfoGov folks, you know that your records are past retention. You know that this is duplicative stuff. You have an exact copy over in the other file share. Why have you been unable to delete this? Well, sometimes I hear no tools. I'm not going to sit there and delete all day. Sometimes I hear, well, we can't find it. The rot is mixed in with the good stuff and nobody knows what's what. But let's be real. What's the real reason? That's the real reason, right? Nobody will let us delete it. Well, that is not going to fly anymore. There's been no real penalty to just keep it forever. Is it messy? Is it taking up, storage space? Does it make searching harder? Like, those are all true and violates our record retention schedule, but okay, right? This is kind of the working mode when along comes data minimization. You can no longer do that. You can't just slide anymore. Data minimization says you will get rid of the data when XYZ occurs. You're not allowed to have a notion of past retention. That's called out of compliance. Those are not, you can't have one without the other here. And so this is the lesson today. There are real consequences to this. And if you think I'm kidding, let me show you. So we're out of compliance. What's the big deal? Well, why don't you ask these folks what the big deal is? And we are talking big deal. These are just GDPR fines, let alone CCPA, the other 11 states that have now enacted legislation and the rest that are coming, okay? You can't just slide or fudge your way through data privacy the way we've been kind of fudging, I was going to say sludging our way through records management. It is simply not going to cut it. All right. I do want to remind you that an easy way to think about this is that with data minimization, you can and you must practice what you preach. In other words, what you state, you have to do, and you have to prove you are capable of doing. Okay? That's a little bit different than records management, where you have your policy and you're not quite executing on that, and there's no real consequence to that. This is the consequence to not being in compliance with what you say. Do what you say. Okay. Have I scared you? I hope I've scared you. Well, not me. GDPR should have scared you. Don't worry. There are some solutions. It gets better now. Okay. So yes, shockingly, auto classification can help you out here. How? Why? Because what is auto classification doing? If somehow you don't know what that is, it is a software that crawls enterprise systems and essentially makes a data inventory, data discovery of everything that's in there, on the order of 50, 60 different types of rich metadata fields. What are those fields? They tend to be things like document type, record type, sensitivity level, contains PII, contains employee information, and on like that. That is what auto classification does. And it comes back and literally gives you a metadata database for every file in your organization. Okay, so can it identify sensitive data? Yes, it can. So that would be, where is the sensitive data? What kind of sensitive data is prevalent there? Does that show up anywhere else? Can I triangulate that? Well, you wouldn't have an SSN, you Canadian.
No, I would not.
What do you have? SIN?
I would have a SIN.
A SIN.
It's social insurance number. Same thing.
It's an adorable Canadian social security number. So she has a SIN, and if I find that SIN somewhere else, I can triangulate and go, oh, that's Jen. Why do I care about that? Because the day that I have the data breach, I need to be able to triangulate that she's been breached here and here. Even if this was the one that got breached, I know she's present here as well. So this is what auto classification kind of brings to the table. What do we have? Where is it? How long am I supposed to keep this for records purposes? How long am I supposed to keep it for legal or e-discovery purposes? How long am I supposed to keep it for data minimization purposes? And given the three, who's on top when? Obviously, who's allowed to see what when, and not just at the file, at the folder level or the application level, but down at the content level. Who's allowed to see redacted? Who's allowed to see unredacted? Obviously, data minimization throughout. We talked about data discovery, compliance. We've kind of beat that to death. I did just mention data incident response. Having something already auto-classified on the day that you get that breach makes your life a heck of a lot better. Policy enforcement. This is a big one for you guys because I hear your frustration all the time about the inability to enforce your records management policies. I feel that data minimization gives you that much more heft to be able to enforce the two of them together. So I find that auto classification helps marry those together and ensure that they're happening. And then, of course, remember, there's this ongoing perpetual need. Auto classification provides that. It's not a one and done. It's a constantly monitoring type of situation.
We've got about 2 minutes left. So
oh my goodness.
We're so close.
Okay.
But if people do have to drop off at 2 and we haven't been able to get to these questions, we'll email you directly. But if you have a chance to stay on, then great. We'll stay as long as we need.
Thank you. All right, I'll go through these last ones very quickly, just so people know how long does it take to set up or configure an auto classification tool to perform data minimization or data analysis type of work. And the answer is usually around 2 to 3 months to get the configuration and setup. But ultimately, you're probably talking a year or longer, just so that people understand. It took you 20, 25 years to amass this data. It's not going to get assessed in 10 minutes. It's probably going to take a year or longer, just so everyone understands. And these are the areas that will affect whether your project takes longer or shorter. And then finally, expect to do implementation in phases. Planning first. I highly recommend you do a proof of concept. In other words, a small set of data, a small set of rules, get that up and running for hopefully a small dollar figure, make sure that's working for you, and then move to full-scale implementation. And then, of course, do not think this is one and done. Remember that there is monitoring basically forever. All right. If this is a hot topic for you, as it is for me, we have a fabulous ebook coming very soon. If you would like to receive this ebook, you can send us an email. You can visit Valora's website. Whatever you need to do, we will make sure this gets in your hands. Here's where to get more information. And I'm ready for Q&A, Jen.
All right. We will I think we'll send out the Q&A afterwards.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. We did have a question. I just answered it directly about the deck being shared afterwards. And yes, we can absolutely send the deck out after the webinar as well. But let's start. I think I'll start at the bottom.
Okay.
There was a question, but it was more of a comment. Great content already. Thank you. That was the comment. Here's one. Do you see vendors like Zoom and Microsoft providing more capabilities to deal with the complexities of retention, permissioning, and legal hold requirements?
I'm going to say yes and no. Yes, I think there will be rudimentary capabilities that are probably aimed at organizations that tend to be smaller or more simplistic than the ones on this call. I don't see, historically, Microsoft and probably Zoom tend to not try to handle incredibly complex or unique situations that most organizations have. Mm-hmm. You're going to need a more customized vendor for something like that, whether that's consulting on top of Microsoft or an organization more like Valora that kind of lives and breathes this stuff and only this stuff all day long. That I think is we're just going to see that play out on these topics too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I just also wanted to add, because we've got our emails up here, that feel free to email questions as well if we don't get to them. Next question is, how can automate, I feel like I should be looking at you when I say this. How can automated systems in recognizing and identifying personal information effectively go beyond easily recognized personal data, like SSNs, to the outer context-dependent perimeter of what is personal information under consumer data privacy laws? We literally just had this conversation like 7 minutes before we started up this webinar.
And there's a couple of answers to that. It helps to understand how auto classification really works, which is it's doing, in essence, some sort of pattern recognition. So it's either doing English language parsing, or it's doing the document type and going, oh, this is a blah-de-blah form, so there's going to be some data nugget over here. Or it's just kind of contextually, basically guessing, statistically guessing. So, so the more a field you get, you can still do it, but maybe your confidence levels change a little. It will kind of depend on how far afield we want to get and how many examples of that there are. The more examples that are out there, the better the technology gets. If this is a 1 in a million kind of circumstance, the technology doesn't have enough kind of exemplars to work from. So sorry for the nuanced answer, but it will kind of depend how fancy and how frequent the need is.
I was not ready with that question. Jake says, hi, Sandy. A couple questions to ponder at some point. Some technology companies whose currency is data, especially big tech, have centralized infrastructure, and those data are leveraged by different products. So 2 questions. 1, what is the direction to manage data use context across common infrastructure, like tracking deletion, for example? And 2, how do we begin to manage data in AI learning models that are trained on enormous data sets to ensure specific data are used in a compliant way when AI provides its functionality?
Okay, I'm going to come back to the AI one. The first one is the words you're looking for are data provenance or data veracity. That is a little bit beyond the scope of this webinar today, but yes, this is a hot area of essentially how do we trust the data that we have, particularly as it's moving through workflows or through a system. This is maybe the 3rd time this has come up this week, and it's only Thursday. So I suspect we will be doing another webinar on these topics. Whoever that was, I'd be happy to have an offline conversation, because that gets really technical really fast. Oh, and the other question about AI. This is a great question. There's all kinds of litigation coming down the pipe now about where did AI get its training data in the first place? And we just scraped the internet, turning out to not be the best defense. And so, yeah, there's going to be all kinds of litigation and regulations coming down about those topics. They're going to be closely tied to data minimization, particularly, are you informing your data subjects that that is why you're collecting data, that you intend to use that data to train an AI? That is going to be something you have to disclose and let them opt out of and manage over the course of the lifetime of that AI. And another fantastic whole discussion. I would love to have this one at a later date too.
Excellent. I don't see any other kind of, I'll say big questions, but some little questions that I will just answer verbally is, yes, we will send the ebook out when it's released. Expect that in the next 2 weeks, but we'll get the deck to everyone probably by the end of the day, probably right after this, if everybody's organized enough. And just some comments. Sandy, just excellent presentation. Cheryl says, thank you. I needed this.
Oh, me too. Me too, Cheryl.
Which is great. So if you do have any other questions, I know we're a little bit over, so thank you very much for sticking around. Yeah, you can certainly email us here and let us know.
Great. We technically have one more slide, which is upcoming webinars for Sapient. You'll notice we have another one coming in November, so hope to see you all there. And Veronica, back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jen and Sandy. This was wonderful as expected. Great information, a lot of information, a lot of wonderful questions, and I love how it always creates conversation. So as Sandy and Jen said, they are more than happy to have those offline conversations. Please don't hesitate to reach out to them and send them questions via email. As they said, there's some upcoming webinars, September 26th with OpenText, October 12th with Epic, the 24th with Encompass. There's more information to come on that. and then November 4th. And it looks like we already have a topic and everything. So that is wonderful. So please join us again on November 4th with Valora. We'd love to have you. Thank you all for attending today. Like we said, we'll be getting out a recording. There will be a survey coming soon, as well as the deck for anyone. And then please, if you haven't already registered for InfoCon, please do so. It's coming up in October 9th through 11th in Detroit. We'd love to have you. Thank you so much, Sandy and Jen. We'll talk to you all soon. Have a wonderful day. See you next time.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.